And yes, Adele, it can be very challenging providing specially designed instruction to virtual students. That's where we need to try to be creative and think outside the box in terms of how we can provide those services. Desmos whiteboards, yes, any of you who have experienced Desmos, that's a really awesome tool to use virtually where you can actually see your students thinking and work all at the same time in real time. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started since we're just after 4 o'clock. I'm going to put in the chat box the link to our Learning Disabilities and Mathematics page. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at this on our website, definitely encourage you to do that now. There are 2 documents that I'm going to be referring to, the frequently asked questions document, as well as our evidence-based specially designed instruction in mathematics resource guide. So I'm Kristen Williams. I'm the Mathematics and Special Education Specialist at the Virginia Department of Education, and I am joined by my colleagues as panelist, Dr. Teresa Lee. She is our Special Education Instructional Services Coordinator. So she's going to try to help me manage the webinar today. There should be a couple other panelists joining us momentarily. So they will be kind of behind the scenes helping with chat and question and answers and so forth. So as far as how you can interact, I understand and recognize that listening to a webinar is not as engaging as participating in a Zoom meeting, but because of the number of participants, we had to kind of keep limited to a webinar. So as far as how you can engage in the session, I encourage you to use your little reactions button down at the bottom. If you scroll your mouse down along the bottom of the screen, you should see some reaction buttons like thumbs up and clapping and so forth. You should also see a chat, which I think a lot of you are comfortable with because I'm seeing chat come in. I've been seeing you put statements into the chat. I do ask you that anything that you do put into the chat is just a statement or is answering a question that I pose to the audience. Try to refrain from putting questions into the chat because the chat scrolls so quickly that we may not be able to catch your questions. So if you do have a question, I would encourage you to please type your question in the Q&A feature down along the bottom of the screen, and either one of the panelists will answer your question through that, or we'll try to answer it live. If you don't see the reactions button, sometimes if you click on the word more, it shows you other options that you might have. Okay, so I just referred to this web page. I'll put the link in the chat box again. If you click on that link, you should go, it should take you to our website, and there's 2 documents that I'm going to be referring to you. There's a frequently asked questions document, which is the red document, as well as the evidence-based specially designed instruction and mathematics resource guide. I'm going to be referring to both of these documents throughout the presentation. So if you want to go ahead and download them and have them on your desktop to refer to, that's great. I will be referring to different pages in those 2 documents. I think a lot of us are getting pretty comfortable with Zoom meetings and virtual settings and are able to kind of toggle back and forth between the webinar screen and another document that we're looking at. So the goal of this session is that you'll have the opportunity to learn about some of the highlighted strategies from these documents and how they can be implemented effectively. So the whole goal of this webinar is to try to give you just a nice overview of all the information that's in both of these documents, and then to kind of give you the motivation and inspiration to find out more. I will be holding some other webinars in 2021 that are going to be more specific to some of the strategies that are shared in these documents. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is I want to see who's participating today. So I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll, and I want to introduce my other colleagues. Deborah Johnson has just joined as a panelist, and Kim Balsam Brown. Deborah Johnson is our intellectual disability specialist at the Virginia Department of Education, and Kim Balsam Brown is our reading dyslexia specialist. So they're also going to help me with managing the chat and the questions and answers. All right, so let's see who's with us today. I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll. And I want you to choose what best describes your role. Are you a special education teacher, general ed teacher, school administrator, math specialist or supervisor, special education supervisor, division level administration, or other? Kind of get an idea of who is our audience today. It looks like getting close to most of you voting. Give it a couple more seconds. All right, I think most of you have voted. I'm going to go ahead and end the polling so we can take a look at who is in the audience today. All right, so Deb and Kim and Teresa, can you see the results on the screen?
Yes,
okay,
I can.
Great, awesome. All right, so we can see that the majority, the 38% of us are special education teachers, but we kind of have a nice mix of other roles and responsibilities. So this is great because if, whatever role that you have, I would love for you to spread this information and share it with your colleagues. All right, let's see here. So if you've had a chance to take a look at these documents at all, the preface kind of goes into what's our vision for students in terms of mathematics in Virginia. And we have the vision that all of the students are going to have high quality, equitable, and engaging math instruction. They're going to participate in relevant learning opportunities. They're going to develop both that conceptual and procedural understanding. They're going to take ownership of their learning. They're going to engage in mathematical discourse, problem solving, and rich tasks. And we also want to exemplify resilience and really promote that growth mindset. Everybody is capable of being a good mathematician and being good at math, and we can all grow our mind and have that growth mindset. So this vision is for everybody, not just our general education students, but this vision is for all of our students, including students with disabilities and diverse learning needs, and it spans across a continuum of settings. So I kind of want to pair that with what special education is. So we have this vision for all of our students in terms of mathematics for Virginia, but we also have our requirements of what we need to do in terms of our students with disabilities and special education. So our special educators who are on this line know that we're required to provide specially designed instruction. That's really what the heart of special education is. So whether you're in a co-taught setting, a self-contained setting, an inclusion setting, you are responsible for making sure that your students with disabilities who have individual education plans are receiving that specially designed instruction, adapting as appropriate to the needs of an eligible child, the content, methodology, or delivery instruction. And of course, that is to meet their unique needs, to meet the needs of the students. And it is to make sure that they have access to that general curriculum. We need to provide that specially designed instruction so they can access the material in the general curriculum. So we like to think of it as specially designed instruction is really coming from the teacher. It's what is that specially designed instruction that the teacher is teaching the students. And then the other aspect of special education, which our special educators who are very familiar with IDEA, includes the supplementary aids and services. And those are those services and supports that we provide students in the general ed class or other educated related settings so that our students with disabilities can be educated to the maximum extent possible as students without disabilities. And that goes along with the whole idea of least restrictive environment. We want our students with disabilities to be educated in the least restrictive environment where they can be successful. So those are really, we think of it as what the student needs. What does a student need to be successful? So I want us to kind of keep that in mind as I'm going through this information. So we really want to kind of keep both of those ideas in mind. What our vision is in terms of mathematics for everybody, but how can we pair that with, you know, making sure that that vision is also for our students with disabilities by providing that specially designed instruction. Okay, so these documents, who are these documents written for? Really, ultimately, which I think most of us on this line are, for educators. There's a really big need that educators need some support in how to provide specially designed instruction in mathematics. So first and foremost, these guides are really for educators. They're also for administrators. How can administrators support their teachers in providing specially designed instruction in mathematics? And then also for parents. These guides are available for parents. They can look at these guides to try to help them when they're working with their children at home. So the whole reason that these documents have been created is because we really want to target how can we improve the learning outcome for students with disabilities in terms of mathematics. I'm sure everybody is aware that there's a pretty big gap in terms of how our students with disabilities are performing on our state standards of learning tests in mathematics compared to the average. I think if I remember correctly, the last data point was that the students with disabilities was a 55% pass rate for standards of learning in mathematics, which is about 30 percentage points than the average. So these guides are really targeted for students who have mathematics difficulties without a formal disability diagnosis. We know we all have worked with students who aren't technically labeled as a student with a disability in mathematics, but has difficulties. It's also for students who have mathematics difficulty with a non-related mathematics related disability. So for example, somebody in the beginning was talking about being able to reach students with dyslexia. Well, oftentimes students with dyslexia also have difficulties in mathematics. And then of course, this is where we really need to make sure we are providing that specially designed instruction. And that's for those students who have a specific learning disability in mathematics and they have IEP goals in mathematics. So these documents are really intended to improve the outcomes of all of these students. So we're going to first take a look at the frequently asked questions document. That's the red one. The first part of that document spent some time on defining mathematics disabilities, and that's on pages 6 to 9 if you have that on one of your other screens as we're talking. So before we go over what are the characteristics, I want you to think about students that you've worked with, students that you've observed. What do you think are some characteristics of a student who has a learning disability in mathematics? So think about what are some characteristics you might see. Just in a couple words, go ahead and type in the chat box. What are some of those characteristics you might see? Slow processing, yes. Difficulty with systemic. Oh my gosh, I can't even say all these at once because you guys are going so fast. But yes, all of these things you're typing. Working memory, slow recall, computation, difficulty remembering the steps, not making connections, difficulty with memorizing facts, weak number sense. Yeah, you guys have it. I think I can probably just skip the next few slides because I see lots and lots of characteristics that you've all noticed. So what's the criteria for math disability diagnosis? And this is according to IDEA. So in Virginia, it's mathematics disability is recognized as one of the conditions under the category of specific learning disability, according to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. So learning disability is an umbrella term that's used to describe a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or in using language, spoken or written, that may manifest itself in the imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations, including conditions such as perceptual abilities, brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, and developmental aphasia. Of course, I'm reading that because I did not memorize that definition. So then when we go further to talk about mathematics disability, it's really, which is often referred to as dyscalculia or developmental dyscalculia. And that's described as the inability to understand and remember mathematics concepts, rules, formulas, basic computation skills, and sequence of operations. Students with dyscalculia have poor understanding of number concept and the number system and skills that are a foundation of higher order mathematical skills. So a lot of those characteristics that you all were typing in the chat box exactly is what we're talking about. So mathematics disability refers to students who have a formal school identification of a specific learning disability in mathematics, and that's under the IDEA federal mandate. And of course, if they have a specific learning disability in mathematics, then their individual education plan or the IEP has to have address those disabilities and have some IEP goals. So what are the signs? So I'm just going to go through real quickly because I think you all already know this. You guys work with students who have disabilities in mathematics. They have difficulty with mental calculations, working very mechanically, struggles to talk about the math processes, has difficulty remembering math facts, loses track when counting, has difficulty remembering steps, confuses numbers like 21 and 12, number crunches to solve word problems. That's where they kind of look and see what numbers are in the problem and just play around with them to see if they can come up with an equation that works. Using fingers to count simple totals. And this comes in, what are some, where do you see this in terms of their skills? They have difficulty with counting. They have difficulty with comparing quantities. You know, that whole number sense idea, understanding operations, fact fluency, problem solving, conceptual understanding. All of these areas you guys were typing in the chat box and they were going so fast I couldn't read them all. Procedural efficiency, spatial reasoning, verbal reasoning, all those are areas that you can see that students would have difficulty with. And then sometimes you see it in other areas that are not specific to math. And some of those other areas are the language and reading, then with memory and information processing, and processing speed and response time. I saw somebody put that in the chat box. Being able to organize their visual spatial processing. Fine motor skills sometimes is an area of difficulty. And of course, attention we see sometimes, difficulties with executive functioning skills, psychosocial skills. So all these kind of coincide sometimes with the actual disability in mathematics. The next section really deals with the other part of special education that we were talking about in terms of what special education really is, and that's the supplementary aids and services for students with disability, with mathematic disabilities. So the information that I'm going to share with you on these next few slides, that comes from pages 12 to 24 in this document. I wanted to mention just real briefly, I know a lot of you probably are coming from school divisions who are part of the Virginia Tiered Systems of Support, VTSS. So I just wanted to mention that when you're looking at these documents, really a lot of the strategies that you find in the frequently asked questions document would be really those strategies and supports that would provide tier 1 supports. And then the strategies that we talk about when we get to the resource guide, the evidence-based specially designed instruction, those strategies really would be applicable more for those tier 2 and tier 3 supports. So as you take a look at the frequently asked questions document, you'll notice there's 3 sections in terms of the supplementary aids and services. So we have a section on modifications, we have a section on accommodations, and we also have a section on assistive technology. So I'm hoping that our special educators, and if we weren't in a webinar and we were able to actually have some conversations, I would ask, who knows? What's the difference between an accommodation and a modification? We often use those words interchangeably, but they're actually very, very different. When you're talking about accommodations are what are those supports that are going to help those students access that grade level curriculum so that they can demonstrate the mastery of that grade level content. So those are supports to help them be at grade level. Where when you're talking about modifications, those are really those when you're thinking about more as far as they're not necessarily accessing the grade level curriculum because you're changing the depth and complexity of that content. And that, of course, would align with what that student's present level of performance is. So as you take a look at the document, you'll see there's a section on recommendations on how you can modify the curriculum for those students who are those are students who are more along of having the going along the aligned standards of learning. But there's ideas of how you can modify curriculum in mathematics. So those of you who teach our students with more significant disabilities, you might really want to take a look at this section a little bit more. And then as you go through the document, you'll notice there are several charts in the accommodation section. And this is pretty cool because each chart goes with a specific area of difficulty. So as you take a look through this document, you'll see that we have whatever the specific difficulties are in terms of that challenge area. What are some accommodations that you can provide to that student to help them access that curriculum? And then along the right-hand side, it gives you some instructional strategies that you can use with those students. So if you peruse through that document, you'll see we have several charts. We have one on language and reading. We have one on memory and information processing, processing speed and response time, visual spatial processing and spatial organization, fine motor skills, executive functioning skills, attention, and psychosocial skills. So definitely take a look at these charts. And again, they're really, really give some great ideas on how you can provide accommodations for those students to be successful in math. I will be sharing this PowerPoint with you. I'll be sending it to you via email after the webinar, probably tomorrow. So that you'll have this PowerPoint that has all of these links, but I also wanted to point you out to this Virginia's Virtual Learning and Accommodation Guide. This is a really great document. It was actually developed back in March, April, when we had all the school closures for COVID. The TTAC centers put this together, and it did a really great job of taking those accommodations that were written in IEPs for face-to-face and how they can be applied to virtual settings. So I definitely encourage you to take a look at this document, especially if you're having trouble figuring out, well, how am I going to provide that accommodation in a virtual setting? And then that last section in the supplementary aids and services piece is the assistive technology component. And just for those of us who aren't familiar with assistive technology, it's defined as any item, piece of equipment, or product system whether acquired commercially, off the shelf, modified, or customized, that's used to increase, maintain, or improve functional capabilities of a child with a disability. So when you're thinking about mathematics, you really want to think about how can you integrate technology so that you can enhance the outcomes of students with learning disabilities in math. So for example, some students with specific learning disability could benefit from using an equation writing software, or could benefit from using virtual manipulatives or a talking calculator. So when you're choosing the assistive technology for students, you really want to think about what are the students' areas of identified need, and how you can support the goal of instruction and support the student outcome. So this section of the document also refers to the AT consideration guide, which IEP teams should really use when they are talking about assistive technology needed for those students. I also wanted to share with you, these are really great resources, especially for those of you, well, really for any setting, but especially for those of you who are in virtual settings. Definitely encourage you to take a look at these AT math resources. The National Center on Accessible Educational Materials, AIM, they have a page that's just dedicated to some classroom tools that help make math content more accessible, with support such as text-to-speech, reading math expressions aloud, sonification of graphs, and so forth. MathShare is really cool. This is this was developed by a nonprofit organization called Benetech, and it's free for all school divisions to use, and you can integrate it in your whatever learning management system you have. And then the other one that I wanted to share with you is Equatio, and that's another software that helps make mathematical equations and formulas much more accessible to students. And this is also offered free for teachers. So these links that are in my PowerPoint will take you to specific information in terms of these AT tools. Okay, I think I'm going to take a deep breath, and I can see there's a bunch of stuff going in the chat, and I see some questions and answers. Teresa, is there anything that we need to address before we start moving on to the resource guide?
You had one question. Will the recording be made available?
Yes, yes. I will email you the recording as well as the PowerPoint. And at some point when the recording becomes accessible, it'll also be loaded onto our webpage.
And the rest of them were just general questions, wanting the links to some of the resources that you're providing. And I told them that it would be in your PowerPoint that you would be providing to them. So
yes, I will send everybody this PowerPoint. And additionally, a lot of the links that I have in the PowerPoint are also in the two guides. So as you're taking a look at the sections, as we talk about them, a lot of these links and resources that I'm going to be sharing with you are actually in the guides as well.
And the final thing was reminding them that when you were talking about IDEA and the federal regs, these definitions are also in the Virginia regs.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And
yes.
That was about it.
All right, great. All right, so that was really just a quick summary of what you could find in the frequently asked questions document. But again, take some time to actually dig into it a little bit deeper, and you'll be able to find a lot of ideas that can especially help you with that tier 1 support and accommodations. So the next part of the webinar, I'm really going to get into the evidence-based strategies that we can use to provide specially designed instruction for students with disabilities in mathematics. And I'm really going to take a look at 5 evidence-based strategies. We're going to take a look at explicit instruction. We're going to take a look at formal math language. We're going to take a look at concrete, representational, and abstract connections, as well as fact and computational fluency, and then finally word problem solving. And again, I'm just giving you very, very brief overviews. I definitely encourage you to dive deeper into each of these, and also be on the lookout for, in January of 2021, I'm going to be providing some webinars, hopefully more interactive webinars on these strategies by themselves. Okay, so this section is going to be on explicit instruction, and that is in pages 6 to 11 in the resource guide. So now we're going to the cover that has the black and white, and explicit instruction is described on pages 6 to 11. So really, explicit instruction is often described as the cornerstone of effective mathematics instruction for students with learning difficulties. So although there's a lot of helpful models of what explicit instruction is, this particular model right here was developed by the National Center on Intensive Intervention. And it really helps you understand exactly what explicit instruction is. So there's 3 components. The first component is the modeling, and that's facilitated by the teacher. The second component is the practice, and that involves both the student and the teacher. And then this part here, which I really think is the key to what explicit instruction is these supporting practices. And the supporting practices consist of an ongoing dialogue between the teacher and the students. There are supports that are actually employed both during the modeling phase and the practice phase. So that's why I really like this visual, because the supporting practices are underneath both the modeling and practice. And these supporting practices are really what makes it explicit instruction. I think a lot of times I hear people describe explicit instruction as I do, we do, you do, but it's so much more than that. To me, the I do, you do, we do is this part, the modeling and the practice. Whoops, I didn't mean to go forward. But it really involves not only the modeling and practice, but the supporting practices. And I'll talk more detailed about the supporting practices in just one moment. So the first part of explicit instruction is the modeling. So modeling includes 2 components. You want to make sure you have clear explanations, and you want to make sure you have planned examples. So your clear explanations, you want to make sure you have at least a 2 to 3 sentence statements about what are the goals of the lesson and why is it important. And that's really, we should be doing that anyway. Whenever we are working with students and teaching them, they should always know what our goals and why this is important. And you're explicitly modeling the steps for solving the problem. You're making sure that you also include important vocabulary and concise language. And you want to make sure you model either one example, but actually several examples, depending on what. So you're really, again, you're thinking about that individual student, depending on what their needs are and their familiarity of the concept. It may be just 1 or 2 examples, but it also might be several examples. And then when you do, so another component of this is you really need to think about you need to plan ahead of time for your explicit instruction. You want to thoughtfully plan examples before the lesson to help the students understand the math concepts. And you're going to ask important questions. You're going to consider examples that are open-ended, worked exampled, which means they're previously solved, or non-examples. So here are some examples of examples if you're teaching division, but a lot of times it's also just as important to show non-examples. So of course, these are some examples of what non-examples would be. And a really, really key component is you want to make sure that that the teacher's not the one who's doing all the talking. So when you're modeling the lesson, even though it's the modeling component, you really want to make sure your students participate. So while you're modeling, you really want to constantly elicit responses from your students so they are constantly engaged with what you are doing. And then the second component of explicit instruction is the practice. So while modeling prepares the students to complete the task, The practice provides multiple opportunities for them to practice the concept. So your practice component includes your guided practice and your independent practice. So your guided practice, of course, is your teacher and your student are practicing together. The teacher solves the problem while the students solve the same problem. And they're working on it together. And again, the teacher is constantly engaging the student and asking for feedback and eliciting responses. Once you have that good guided practice, then you can move to independent practice. And it's not like you're just sending the kids off by themselves to work independently. Independent practice still requires some teacher support. You know, it's probably not always a good idea to assign independent practice as homework, because oftentimes, especially our students with mathematics disabilities, they still need to have that teacher support when they're practicing independently. So this is really, if you take anything away from this webinar on explicit instruction, I want you to understand that it's so much more than I do, we do, you do. It really involves these supporting practices that are happening at the same time. So you want to make sure you're asking the right questions. You want to constantly be asking questions to your students and having them respond and engage with you. And those questions should be low level and high level. You want your students to experience success. So you want to include low level questions, which are pretty, require simpler answers. And those are really more checking for the whole procedural understanding. But you also want to make sure that you ask higher level questions to encourage that deeper thinking and then also to be able to help you assess their conceptual understanding. You want to make sure you're eliciting frequent responses. So again, it's that engagement, constant engagement back and forth of the teacher and student responding to each other. And it has to occur frequently. So frequent responses could be class-wide, could be individual, could be partner, could be right on the whiteboard, it could be thumbs up, anything that is asking that student to actually respond. And you also want to make sure that when you are modeling and practicing, that you're providing that affirmative and corrective feedback. So affirmative feedback proves most effective when students receive specific comments about concepts or procedures. Like, I noticed you using the counting up strategy to add those two numbers. So it's much deeper than just saying good job. You're actually being specific. You're giving specific feedback in what those students are doing with the with the procedures. And then corrective feedback is provided when by teachers when students make a mistake or misunderstand a concept or procedure, and it involves encouraging students to explain their thinking. So oftentimes with that corrective feedback, you also want to make sure and this provides support and helps the student gain practice in explaining their thinking. So can you explain the steps you followed for this problem? And oftentimes when the student explains what they were doing, you can really hone in on what their conceptual misunderstanding is. And then finally, as part of those supporting practices, is maintaining a brisk pace. Yeah, it seems like, oh, well, shouldn't we go slower? No, actually, you just want to keep moving because you want to keep the kids engaged. Okay. So you really want to, so really when you're providing explicit instruction, it does take a lot of planning. It's something that you want to plan ahead of time for, so you can make sure you have all the examples that you need, the non-examples, and what kinds of questions are you going to ask? What materials am I going to need for the lesson? What ways will I incorporate technology, which in virtual instruction, we really need to think about that for those of you who are doing virtual instruction. What examples will I use? What planned examples will I use? So you really want to make sure that you're planning for that explicit instruction. Okay, so I talked a lot. I did a very quick overview of explicit instruction, and the document actually has some links to some videos from the National Center intensive intervention that really shows some good examples of what explicit instruction looks like, where you're seeing that constant engagement and that you're seeing those supporting practices. So I just want to take a minute or two to reflect. I know I kind of went over this pretty quickly, but is there something new that you learned about explicit instruction? If you learned something new with my quick overview, type what you learned in the chat box. Ongoing dialogue, quick pace, supporting practices, non-examples, very good. Brisk pace, it's much more than I do, we do, you do. Yes, I love that. So anytime you explain what explicit instruction is, really help people understand it is much more than I do, we do, you do. And the other thing too is explicit instruction, that explicit instruction is instruction that is evidence-based for students with disabilities. This doesn't mean that if you're a general ed teacher or you're a special ed teacher that you're going to do all your lessons with explicit instruction. It's based on what what individual students need. So you might be in a co-taught classroom where you might just pull a few kids, and when you're doing stations or when you're doing alternative teaching, and you might do explicit instruction with those few students who need it, but that doesn't necessarily means you need to do explicit instruction with the whole class. All right, awesome. I'm glad you learned some different things about explicit instruction. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is formal mathematical language, and that is discussed on pages 12 to 17 in the resource guide. So it's really, really important to use formal mathematical language. I know that, and I was just as guilty of this when I first started teaching, as I would try to use informal words to help kids remember math. And evidence shows that students will make much more progress and have much more understanding if you make an effort to use formal mathematical language. So examples of formal mathematical language would be like you using the word sum or digit or numerator. Informal language is if you say something like answer or number or the top number in the fraction. So when you're providing instruction, you want to make sure that as you are providing your instruction, that you are always using the formal mathematical language. You want to make sure that you use the terms precisely, and you want to make sure you use the terms concisely. All right, so what do I mean by precise? So an example of precise is the denominator is the number of equal parts that make the whole. A difference problem is two amounts compared for the difference. So those are examples of using precise language. Here are some examples of concise language. To show the fraction, look at the denominator. A denominator of 5 means I need to break the whole into 5 equal parts. Here's another example. To use partial sums, add the hundreds, then add the tens, then add the ones, finally add all the partial sums. So why does language present a challenge for students with mathematics difficulty? And I think you guys kind of alluded to this in the beginning when we were talking about the characteristics of students with mathematics disabilities. So oftentimes the comorbidity rate is that they estimate that between 30 to 70% of students are identified with 2 disabilities, one of which is a disability that involves language. And as many of you indicated earlier as well, oftentimes students with mathematics learning disabilities also experience reading difficulties. And researchers estimate that at least 2 of 4 students will have comorbid reading and mathematics challenges. So that's pretty impactful, which is a reason why, which is just another support for why we need to make sure we use formal mathematical language. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples and just think about, maybe just reflect in your own practice if there are any terms that you, and like I said, we often use it because we think it's going to make it easier for the students and it'll help them understand, but actually it's better for you to use those correct terms. So instead of saying, for example, what numbers in the tens place, well, it's not, I mean, a number could be 565. You're actually talking about the digit. Here's another one, 648. Well, we know we say and for the decimal point, right? So you actually shouldn't say that and 648. We want to avoid saying bigger number and smaller number. We want to use the correct terminology that's either greater or less. The numbers in the fraction. Again, the fraction's a number, right? The digits are in the numerator and digits in the denominator, but the actual entire fraction is a number. We don't want to use top number and bottom number. We always want to say the correct terms. We're referring to their numerator and their denominator. I'm sure you guys can probably figure out why we wouldn't want to use the word reduce. I know a lot of us grew up reducing fractions, but it gives the sense that we're changing the quantity of the fraction, but we're not. It's an equivalent fraction. And we want to avoid using point for our decimal number. So instead of saying 1.9, we want to say 1 9/10. Again, here are some other quick examples. Instead of corner, we want to say angle or vertex. The easy words for, or the shorter words for transformations, let's use their real terminology: reflection, translation, rotation. So you guys are getting the hang of it. So you really want to make an effort to use, whenever you're doing any type of an instruction, and not only you use the correct terminology, but help your students use it and really provide, and take notice of when they're using the proper terminology and encourage it. So I wanted to take, I'm guessing most of you have utilized or been exposed to, but on our website, we have our VDOE word wall cards. And we have these from kindergarten to algebra 2. And they were very helpful in supporting the whole idea of using formal mathematical language, because not only do they have the definitions on what they are, but they have the visuals to go along with the words. So if you have used the VDOE word wall cards, do you have any ideas on how we can use those? And if you're doing hybrid instruction or virtual instruction, have any of you utilized these in those settings? Talking about preaching vocabulary, yes, L students, definitely. Using them for anchor charts in the modules, definitely. That's a great idea. Putting them in a study guide. Oh, I like somebody mentioned using gestures. Keep that in mind, because we're going to talk about gestures for our schema instruction. Using them in Google Slides, awesome. And I like that somebody noted that you use so I talked a little bit about explicit instruction, but that kind of folds over into other areas. So sometimes you need to explicitly teach vocabulary. It may not come naturally, so you need to use that in explicit instruction and when you are teaching the vocabulary. Oh, I like that. Gallery walks, awesome. So it looks like a lot of you have used these already, and if you haven't used them, now you know where to find them, and you can integrate them in your instruction. Awesome. All right. So Teresa, do I need to stop for a couple of minutes for questions?
Yes, you have a question.
Okay.
How do others support teaching mathematical language and help students retain it? I think your word wall cards is a good suggestion, but any other suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, just again, you constantly using it in your instruction and encouraging students. So if you notice a student says, Oh, because the top number is smaller, then you can provide some questioning to that student. What top number? What are you, what do you know what that number is called? So just constantly reinforcing, even when students use that formal. And again, a lot of you had some good suggestions in the chat as far as using anchor charts. A lot of teachers use the word wall cards for vocabulary notebooks. Some teachers have put them on little rings and making like a flip chart. So yeah, it's just the continuous use of it is going to help that retention. Is there any others that I need to address before I move on?
Oh, I see no other questions. They have put the link in the chat box for the word wall card. So the vocabulary cards. Thanks.
Excellent. Yes. And they're also in this PowerPoint. So you'll have that when you get the PowerPoint. All right. The next section in our evidence-based specially designed instruction talks about concrete representational abstract connections. I'm pretty sure probably all of you are familiar with concrete representational abstract, but it is so important in using concrete representational and abstract connections when you are working with students with disabilities in mathematics. So of course you have your concrete, representational, and abstract, and oftentimes we think of it as a sequence, as far as first you do the concrete, and then you do the representational or the pictorial, and then you do the abstract. But we really want to help you think about it more in terms of this, if you look at this visual, that they all really connect with each other. It's not always necessarily a sequence where you do C first, then R, and then A. Oftentimes they interact, and sometimes, and really it depends on your students' needs. Some students benefit from having a lot more concrete exposure before they can get to the pictorial and abstract. Some students are pretty quickly understanding the abstract, where you can show the connections between the abstract and the concrete and representational. So of course, your concrete is anything that you have three-dimensional, and they can be specifically math oriented, such as fraction bars or algebra tiles or tangrams, but they can also include hands-on manipulatives, or even just objects that you have around the classroom, or in this case, if you're doing virtual objects that the students have around their house. And then of course your representational, which often is considered another synonym is pictorial. Those are those two-dimensional images. So in many cases, the pictorial is referred to as semi-concrete, or it's also referred to as representational. And oftentimes we use graphic organizers, and graphic organizers is also considered a pictorial representation. And then of course your abstract form is where you get to the numerals and symbols. So in many cases, the abstract form of the mathematics is what the student's destination is, but we have to make sure we use the concrete and pictorial representations to support the student's understanding of the abstract. As you take a look in that, when you can take a look at the guide in a little bit more detail, there's two really good examples, an elementary example and a middle school, high school example with algebra, on how using the concrete representational abstract gives so much more meaning, especially with conceptual understanding, as opposed to just teaching a abstract form. So I wanted to show you a real quick, actually, let me see if I have time. You know what? I think I might skip this one, but this link is in your PowerPoint. It's an example. It's also on the National Center for Intervention. It was an example of a teacher using virtual based 10 blocks. So of course, now that so many of us are in virtual instruction or hybrid instruction, we've really had a lot more need for those virtual manipulatives. So this is a video that has an example of how this teacher used virtual based 10 blocks. but I also wanted to give you some other resources. So when you're thinking about that representational piece and the pictorial piece in our virtual setting that many of us are in now, we need to really try to utilize those virtual manipulatives. So I have 5 sites here that are really great resources for virtual manipulatives. And I wanted to see if any of you wanted to add a few that you have discovered in the chat box. So let me, and other than those sites that I just mentioned, does anybody have any other suggestions of where they have found some great virtual manipulatives? The other thing that I have found is that if I'm Braining Camp, okay. Yes, I will try to go back one side, but my problem is my screen. I can't see my arrows on my screen. Let's see if I can do it. Okay, here we go. So I have National Library of Virtual Manipulatives, the Toy Theater, Math Playground, Math Learning Center has a lot of really good ones. GeoGebra, Didax, that's another good one. And I've also found that if I just do a Google search and type in whatever manipulative I'm looking for, they come up. I think there's a virtual manipulative for everything. Mathspot.com has a lot of good ones. So yeah, these are some really great resources, especially for supporting that virtual instruction that we find ourselves in. And again, that explicit instruction piece sometimes feeds into the concrete representational-Abstract. Sometimes you have, when you're doing that explicit instruction, you are using the concrete representational-Abstract connections in providing that instruction. All right, awesome. All right, we have 2 more sections. You guys are doing a great job staying with me. I know that being on a webinar without being able to engage is probably not the most fun thing to do, especially after you've worked all day. But I have 2 more areas to share with you, and hopefully you'll be able to take some of this back to your classrooms. So the 4th area is fluency building, and that's found on pages 25 through 27 in your resource guide. A lot of you noted in the beginning when we were talking about characteristics is a lot of our students with mathematics difficulties and disabilities are not fluent. So fluency practice offers an evidence-based strategy for supporting students with mathematics difficulties. So if you've taken a look at our curriculum framework, which I'm guessing you have if you're a math teacher, whether you're general ed or special ed, it defines computational fluency being flexible, efficient, and accurate for methods for computing. So students exhibit computational fluency when they can demonstrate strategic thinking and flexibility in the computational methods that they choose and are able to explain and produce accurate answers efficiently. So that's kind of a, what does it really mean to be fluent? So the computational methods that are used by a student should directly align with the mathematical ideas that the student understands, including the structure of the base 10 number system, the number relationships, the meaning of operations, and the properties. So this is kind of getting to the idea that you really want to try to pair that fluency practice and fact practice with conceptual understanding, because oftentimes students don't necessarily have to memorize all of their facts if they can use different strategies to figure them out. So when we're talking about fact fluency, of course, we have our adding, subtracting, multiplication, and division facts. And the 2 main takeaways is that whenever you practice fact fluency with students, is you want it to be brief. You don't want to spend an hour with them practicing their facts. It needs to be brief. And daily. So if you do it brief and daily and keep doing it brief and daily every day, that starts to build up the students' fluency. Let's see here. So another part of the guide that I wanted to point out to you and this can be found in that section, in the fluency section, is these are just some strategies for when you're developing addition and subtraction facts. And they kind of go beyond the whole memorizing. So a lot of these strategies, you know, using the doubles, making 10 facts, thinking addition for subtraction, if you share these strategies with students, and again, some students will pick up strategies. Some students will pick up strategies and prefer those strategies over a strategy that maybe another student prefers. So again, just like with special education, it's very individualized. What works for that student? So in that book or in the document, I wanted to point out to you that we had a lot of good suggestions for strategies for adding and subtracting facts, and we also have a lot of good suggestions for developing multiplication and division facts. So I wanted to point that out to you to take a look at. So again, talking about how fluency activities need to be brief and daily, and it's important to, while you're doing those fluency activities, to also kind of pair it with some numeracy routines so that we're developing that conceptual understanding. So we can do just, these are some examples of what you could do with, you could do games with cards, you know, you can do the file folder game. These are called wrap-ups. Some of you are probably familiar with those. Making a game out of it by rolling dice and doing your different facts. This is a magic square. I'm not sure if you can see that very clearly on your screen, but a magic square template's always kind of a fun way for kids to practice their fact, where they put a number in the corner and then they have to come up with equations that either add up or multiply that to that number horizontally and also vertically. There's specific directions on how to do it in the guide. It's in one of the appendices. It has all of these games and how to play them. You know, playing with dominoes is a good one. And then this last one, you know, some kids like to compete against themselves. So they like to keep track of how many facts they know each day. And I just want to just caution that, you know, it's not good to have kids compete against each other and have to display their graphs. That's not a good mathematical mindset activity to do. So I would just take caution that if this works for a student and they like to graph and see their progress, that it's an individual type of activity. All right, so how about, let's see if anybody else has some good ideas for practicing fluency. Somebody mentioned an app called Reflex that helps build fluency. I'm not familiar with that one. MobiMax, yes. That's, I've heard of that. Reflex is very fast. Yeah, I think that's another thing we have to be very careful of is timed, because timing a student is often a very huge anxiety producer. And, you know, doing the, you know, some of you probably were in classes as a student where you would do mad minutes, or when, you know, everybody, or the class where you would do around the world and everybody would sit down if they couldn't get those kinds of things. I think are not good for students' mathematical mindsets and should be avoided. Math fact fluency, 60+ games and assessment tools. All right, awesome. Jennifer Bay Williams, yeah, she has a lot of good stuff. Number routines are really good, Kim. And the number routines are really helps with the whole conceptual understanding piece. And Joe Bowler, yes, I'm so glad. That's actually linked in, that's linked in the document as well. Joe Bowler has, she has a whole part of her website that's designated to special education. Looking at patterns, yeah, that's a really good way to practice fluency. Awesome. All right, thank you for hanging in with me. We have one more topic, and that is problem solving. And that can be found on pages 28 to 39 in your resource guide. This is probably the one, if I had to say the biggest area that we struggle with, that not just students with disabilities, but all kids, is the problem solving. So here's a picture of a typical problem, or typical word problem. They show a graph of tickets for a play were sold on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. They show a graph with the day of the week and how many tickets were sold. And then the question is, if a total of 900 tickets were sold for the play, how many tickets were sold on Wednesday? So thinking about this problem, before I talk about anything else, I also wanted to point out that in our curriculum framework, when we're talking about what it means to become a mathematical problem solver, becoming a mathematical problem solver represents one of the 5 mathematics process goals. And to become a mathematical problem solver, students must apply mathematical concepts and skills and understand the relationships among them to solve problems of varying complexities. Students must also recognize and create problems from real world data and situations within and outside mathematics and apply appropriate strategies to determine acceptable solutions. To accomplish this goal, students need to develop a set of skills and strategies for solving a range of problems. So that kind of just gives a highlight of what it really means to be a problem solver. And here's an example of a word problem that you might see. So I want you to think about, why do you think problem solving is so challenging for students with disabilities or difficulties in mathematics? Enter your thoughts in a couple words in the chat box. So why is problem solving such a huge area of difficulty, especially for students with mathematics difficulties or disabilities? Reading definitely can be hard for them. Difficulty organizing the information, multi-steps, their mindset. Sometimes they just can't do it. They don't have a plan. They have executive functioning issues, the number sense, having difficulty with the language, too much wording, not enough practice, can't make connections, conceptualizing, figuring out what the question's asking. Yes, all of those are reasons why problem solving can be so difficult. Picking out what's important. Yeah. Difficulty processing the information and remembering steps, lack of generalization of skills. So you guys you're saying all the things that we notice with why problem solving can be so difficult. So research has really narrowed it down to these 7 areas, and they're really what you guys just put in the chat box. The reading, difficulty with reading the problems. Understanding the vocabulary, which again goes back to the idea that if we use that mathematical formal language all the time, hopefully that will alleviate some of that vocabulary understanding issue. Picking the relevant information, what's important in this problem. Ignoring the irrelevant information, what information in this problem do I not need to solve it? Another biggie is interpreting those charts and graphs. Can be very difficult. And then figuring out what operation do I do. And all of these you all mentioned in the chat. Performing, and then actually, once they figured out a strategy or what operation to do, actually being able to perform the computation. All right, so I'm going to tell you 3 things in terms of problem solving, 3 key points that I want you to take away. The first one is don't tie keywords to operations. And I am guilty of doing this. I know when I first started teaching for several years, I had the keyword posters in my classroom. We all thought that using keywords would help students figure out what to do with a word problem. But guess what? It doesn't. Research shows that keywords do not help. So that's definitely a don't. We don't want to use keywords. If you come out with anything from this section, do not use keywords. But we want you to have an attack strategy. So one of the things that students have difficult, one of the reasons problem solving is so difficult for students is because they just don't know where to start. They don't have an attack strategy. They don't have a strategy for solving problems. So we want to make sure our kids have problem solving attack strategies. And in this situation, many of our students with disabilities, not only do you need to help them learn an attack strategy, but you're probably going to need to explicitly teach your students that attack strategy so that they get to the point where they are using that attack strategy on their own without your prompts. And then the third do is teaching word problem schemas. And this is something that's relatively new for me. But it's definitely evidence-based, and teaching word problem schemas kind of replaces that whole thought that we do keywords. All right, so again, if we remember anything, we don't want these posters in our classrooms. If you have them anywhere, take them down. If you're in a face-to-face classroom, take them off your walls. If you have them in any of your virtual classrooms or your Google classrooms, take them off. It doesn't work. So from a teaching perspective, it doesn't make sense to teach students a strategy such as keywords that leads to incorrect responses. So really, one of the biggest reasons that we don't want to use keywords is because they often they don't always go to just one operation. And here's an example. A lot of kids will think, oh, I see the word share, that means I need to divide. And they don't look at anything else in the problem. They just see the word share and they think they have to divide. Well, look, here's two examples where it doesn't mean division. So in this first example, it does. Navia wants to share 36 brownies with 6 friends. How many cookies will each friend receive? It means division in that problem. But look at this one. Nevaeh baked 36 brownies and shared 16 brownies with her friends. How many brownies does she have now? Well, obviously in this situation, it doesn't mean division. So we don't want to teach that strategy because half the time it doesn't work. You do want to have an attack strategy. So as I was telling you, and a lot of times you're going to have to explicitly teach your students the attack strategy. These are just some examples. UPS, understand, plan, solve, check. That one's used a lot. Ridges, read the problem. I do an I know statement, draw a picture, and so forth. So these are just different examples. But you'll notice that the first step for all of these examples is really reading and understanding the problem. So no matter what strategy you explicitly teach your student to use, you want to explicitly teach it to them so that they use it all the time, so that they get to the point that they use that strategy on their own. And then the third piece with problem solving, and I'm going to have to do this part really quick because I'm getting close to my 5:30 time and I don't want to keep you later. But this kind of replaces that whole keyword idea. And if you're familiar with our mathematics curriculum framework, they really coincide with our problem types. So especially in our third and fourth grade curriculum frameworks, when they're talking about problem types, this is kind of the same idea. So when you're looking at schemas, it really refers to the structure of a word problem. So we have six schema types. So the 3 on the left are considered additive schemas, total, difference, and change. And then these on the right are the multiplicative schemas, equal groups, comparison, and ratio proportions. So I could do a whole day session on word problem schemas. So I hope to have some webinars on this in January, because you need more than just a 10-minute description on being able to use it with your students. But I wanted to at least introduce it to you and kind of give you maybe the motivation to learn more about it and maybe come back and do the webinar that I do in January. but it's a really good replacement for that keyword idea where you're teaching the students to look at the structure of the word problem. So here's an example of a total, and in our curriculum framework, it's considered part, whole, or combined. So those problems in our curriculum framework that are described as this are the same thing as total problems. And as you can see, it's the structure, and each of these schemas has a graphic organizer that goes along with it that can really help the students figure out what the structure of the problem is. So sometimes the problem might be asking for the total, but other times the problem might be asking for one of the parts. So putting it in this graphic organizer often helps student figure out what operation they actually need to do. Here's an example of the difference additive schema, and in our curriculum framework, they're referred to as compare. But this is where when you have larger and smaller amounts compared for a difference. So in this example, so, you know, some teachers might think, oh, you can only figure this out because you have to subtract. But when you look at the structure of the problem, depending on how kids think and what their mathematical understanding is, some kids might think to themselves, oh, I have to add up from 68 to get to 107. But other kids might look at it and say, I need to subtract 68 from 107. And guess what? Either way works. So if we were teaching a keyword strategy, they would just be doing one operation, and there's more than one operation that you can use to solve this problem. And then the other additive schema is the change, which change can be considered when you're joining, or it can be considered separating. So you have a number where you're starting, and it's either going to be a change increase to an end number, or it's going to be a change decrease. And again, as they read through the problem and look at the situation, they can figure out what part of the graphic organizer you would put each number. And since I'm running low on time, I'm not going to show you these videos either, but this comes from the Supporting Teaching of Algebra Individual Readiness. And this video is actually done by Dr. Sarah Powell, and she was one of our collaborators in these documents. But along with the graphic organizers for the schemas, she also has gestures. So we know a lot of our students with disabilities need those multi-sensory inputs. So having the visual with a graphic organizer, and then having the gestures that go with, like her example of the total is we have two parts and we put them together. So that's the gesture. Her example of the difference is we have a greater amount and we have a lesser amount. What's the difference? So there's different schemas. So you really just get the kids to well, what schema is this? And they can do the gestures with it. And it really helps to develop that understanding too. And you can even do them with number lines, like here's your greater number, here's your lesser number, what's the difference? So definitely take a look. And these are also linked in the document. And then your multiplicative schemas, you have your equal groups, groups multiplied by a number, and each group for a product. And her visual is, you have each group here multiplied by a number. And this is your visual that helps students determine. And again, sometimes the problem might be asking for the product, but sometimes the problem might be asking for the group or the rate. And the students, they can use multiplication to solve it, but they might, if they're looking for the group or the rate, they might multiply up to get the product, or they might divide. So looking at the structure helps them kind of figure out what operation that they want to use to figure it out. And then here's your comparison. A comparison is when a set is multiplied by a number of times for a product. So here's an example of a comparison problem. And again, this is what the graphic organizer looks like. And then the last one, and this schema, of course, we really don't get into too much until middle school with ratios and proportions. But again, thinking about that whole, well, if this, then this, and if this graphic organizer helps look at those proportional relationships. And here are some more. This video actually has all of the schemas together. So she goes through both the additive schemas and the multiplicative schemas. All right, I'm going to stop there for a second and ask Teresa if there's any questions up to this point.
There were a few questions about virtual manipulatives, especially for the higher level math, such as geometry. I suggested that they email you and check the guidance document. There may be a few examples in there, but I figured,
yeah, I think, yes, definitely. My content specialty is middle school. But I know, and actually there's probably some people on this call who might be able to put some suggestions in the chat as far as virtual manipulatives for the higher level classes. But I know like algebra tiles can be used all the way up to algebra 2. I don't say that right. GeoGebra is a good one. So it looks like some of the participants are putting some suggestions in there as well for the higher courses.
And I think that you will be saving the chat. A lot of people have put a lot of great links. So we definitely can provide them with some of those links also.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I'll take a look through the chat, and when I email the PowerPoint out, I can add any of the links that were shared in the chat. All right, so I wanted to encourage you to, if you haven't already done so, sign up to receive the Special Education Instructional Service newsletters. They're probably sent out every week or two, and they have the most, information about upcoming professional development and so forth, and different resources. So I definitely encourage you to sign up for those. And then I also just wanted to include in this PowerPoint some of our resources that we have on our website. I know that when I was teaching, before I started working for the Virginia Department of Education, I knew there were a lot of resources on the website, and I used some of them, but I didn't know, like, I didn't realize how many, there are so many resources on our website that everybody can really use, and especially use during this time when we need resources. So here are some links to some resources that could help support your mathematics instruction. The co-teaching plans, if you haven't had a chance to look at those, we have math co-teaching plans, and they also give examples of specially designed instruction, accommodations, and modifications. The vertical articulation tool is really helpful in identifying those prerequisite skill areas where you may see some gaps. We have remediation plans that align with the SOLs from grades 4 through 8, as well as formative assessments. So the formative assessments can be very helpful, especially because we have our students missing a few months of school from last year and trying to help fill in those gaps and figure out where their skills are. And that goes into the just-in-time mathematics quick checks. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at these, definitely recommend. We have some PD webinars that are located on this page as well that talks about how you can use them. All right, so I'm pretty good on time. I won't be taking you after 5:30. So I just want you to think about, this was a really, really quick overview of a lot of information. I hope it's given you some inspiration to find out more about some of the strategies that I shared. But I want you to think about, how can you use these guides to assist you in your instructional planning? And whether you're a general educator or a special educator or an administrator, how could you support teachers in using these guides in their planning? And then I also want you to think about, how can you incorporate these strategies to ensure that your students with disabilities are receiving specially designed instruction? So again, circling back to the beginning when I was talking about, we have this vision of mathematics for all of our students, but we also have our students who have individual education plans and who require special education, which is specially designed instruction. So how can you incorporate some of these strategies so that you can ensure that your students are receiving that specially designed instruction. So I'm going to give you a minute or two and add your ideas to the chat to either of these questions.
Kristen, there's a couple questions about what is the link for the weekly emails. You can put that in the email with the PowerPoint maybe?
Yeah, it's actually in the PowerPoint too.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Will there be a webinar or professional development around schemas?
Yes, that is definitely one that I'm going to do.
That is great.
Definitely. Yeah. Because you could spend a whole day on schema-based instruction.
And one question, how does schemas work with a multi-step word problem? So definitely that's something that
yeah, that would be, yeah. I'm glad that your big takeaway was schemas versus keywords. That's awesome. Planning to look over the explicit instruction guide to help move forward. Awesome. Yes, the accommodations from the fact document is awesome. Revise strategies for teaching word problems. Wonderful.
You had someone to write about IEP goals. I would strongly encourage them to use the math worksheets that we have in determining the area of need.
Yes, on our standards-based IEP page on our website, there are specific skill worksheets that help you write standards-based mathematics goals. Excellent. So it looks like it looks like everybody's taking something away from this webinar. I hope it wasn't too boring. I know that it can be challenging listening to a webinar after a full workday and when you can't do a ton of engaging. Well, it doesn't look like I have any other questions that we haven't addressed. I appreciate all of you coming. Your students are definitely very lucky that you are dedicated and receiving additional professional development on top of everything else you have to do.